Good evening, everyone. My name is Babar Habib. I'm the co-founder CEO of Portfolio School, as well as CEO of Tribeca Community School. I want to welcome all of you to this event, a community event, which hopefully is the first of many that we will do in the Tribeca area and in the school year. Before I start, I wanted to thank a few people who made this event possible. And I'll start with the parent book club of Portfolio School. Last year, they read this book as part of the book club, fell in love with it, and had many exciting discussions around it. And one of the parents, Terry Hagedorn, she suggested that, you know what, we should have the authors come in and speak to the broader community. So thank you, Terry, and thank you to the book club. And Terry, not only just for suggesting, but helping us make this happen. Special thank you to Doug as well, my co-founder, who relentlessly worked on this over many months now. Yes, that's right. And you know, we're a small school, Portfolio School, and whenever an event like this happens, it's the full Portfolio team that makes it happen. So thank you to the Portfolio team as well. A special thank you to Town Stages, the event space that you're in. They worked really hard with us and gave us a good deal, so it's a good space. As well as Andrew Cover Catering. So I'm going to mention them as well, a shout out to them. Before I introduce the authors, I'm going to do a poll. How many parents are here in the audience today? Raise your hands if you're a parent. All right. There are like 2 people who are not. I believe they work in a school, so I think it's okay. Okay, let's see. Then the next question is, how many parents of children ages 1 to 5? All right, that's quite a bit. And 5 to 10? A few, yeah, good. And 10 and above? All right. Above 35? You should raise. Here my parents. My parents are sitting right in front. All right, so with that, let's let me introduce tonight's authors and speakers. The book is co-written by William Stixrud, who's a PhD in clinical neuropsychology and is a faculty member at Children's National Medical Center and George Washington University Medical School. He lectures widely on the adolescent brain, meditation, and the effects of stress, sleep deprivation, and technology overload on the brain. He has published several influential scientific articles and is on the board of the David Lynch Foundation. And Ned Johnson is the founder of Prep Matters, a tutoring service in Washington, D.C., and the co-author of Conquering the SAT, How Parents Can Help Teens Overcome the Pressure and Succeed. A sought-after speaker and teen coach for study skills, parent-teen dynamics, and anxiety management. His work has been featured on NPR, NewsHour, U.S. News and World Report, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. Just a few quotes in praise of the book before we start. The first one is from NPR, and they said, instead of trusting kids with choices, many parents insist on micromanaging everything from homework to friendships. For these parents, Stixrud and Johnson have a simple message: stop. And then Sir Ken Robinson, who we're big fans of, he's a New York Times best-selling author of Creative Schools. He said, important and timely, and is an essential book for parents and educators everywhere. So with that, let me welcome Ned and Bill.
Thank you, Babar. We had a chance to tour the school today and the Portfolio School. I'm really impressed. It's rare for me to see schools that are so different and so beautifully committed to doing things in a healthy way. It's great. Ned and I became friends 8 or 9 years ago, and we started. We really think a lot alike. We have very different careers, but we think a lot alike, and we both think a lot about how do kids become self-motivated, and we also think a lot about. Yeah, we also think a lot about what stress, but being chronically stressed does to kids' development. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So I make a living. I'm a neuropsychologist and make a living testing kids. And I've been doing it for 34 years. I still love it. I never get tired of it. In part because I love what kids say. Some years ago, I asked a 5-year-old the first question on a vocabulary test. I said, "What's a cow?" He said, "I can't believe you don't know that." Last year, within 2 months, I tested two kids with autism. And they looked over to the side of my desk, and they saw a picture of me in a tuxedo and my daughter in a wedding dress. They said, "You got married?" I said, "Yeah, 40 years ago. That's me at my daughter's wedding." And they both said, "You married your daughter?" It's honest work. But what really has been striking Ned and I for the last several years is that so many of the kids that we see, including fairly young kids, have already been diagnosed with anxiety disorders. And we've also been struck by how many kids that Ned sees particularly who are just obsessively driven to achieve and to get into elite colleges, and how many kids I see who figure that's never going to happen, why bother work hard at anything. And so it turns out we were talking about, a couple of years ago we started talking about what are the things that we know that really help people, and what's the best ways to organize our thinking about it. And Ned at one point said, I think that everything that we teach to people is organized around this idea of a sense of control. And we knew, and we've been lecturing for years about the fact that a low sense of control may be the most stressful thing in the universe. Sonia Lupien, a neuroscientist in Canada, says there's 4 things that make life stressful. And you can summarize it with the acronym NUTS. It's novelty, unpredictability, threat, and a low sense of control. And arguably, it's that low sense of control that's most stressful. And we also knew that every place we looked in terms of how do kids become self-motivated, all the arrows pointed in the direction of autonomy or a sense of control. This is my life, and I get to develop it in a way that makes sense to me. And it motivates, because this is my life, I'm motivated to work hard to develop it. And so we figured the sense of control must be a pretty big deal if it's so related to stress and stress-related problems, and it's so important for motivation. And then the more we studied, it's just absurd, because having a healthy sense of control over your own life is good for everything. It's good for physical health, it's good for longevity. If you're in a nursing home and you you're in a nursing home and you're just given choices. Do you want a visitor to come at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock? Do you want your lunch at 11 or 12:30? You'll live longer. It's just the brain works well when you experience a healthy sense of control. And we want kids to have a healthy sense of control over their own life, starting from the time that they're pretty little. And many of you have young children. We'll talk a bit as we go on here about how you can start to foster that in young children. It just turns out, though, that it's that because when you experience a sense of control, basically what happens in your brain is that your prefrontal cortex, which can think rationally, can put things in perspective, regulates the rest of the brain. When you feel a low sense of control and you start to get stressed, the amygdala, the part of the brain, the very primitive part of the brain that senses and reacts to threat, it doesn't think, it just senses and reacts, starts to run the rest of your brain. And so it's so important for people to have this healthy sense of control. So we decided, let's write a book about it. Now, I mentioned that really we talk about the twin scourges of stress-related mental health problems and these motivational issues related to the difficulty kids have finding healthy motivation. that self-drive, as opposed to just obsessively feeling that they have to pursue certain things to be successful, or kids who really don't have any internal motivation. And so in terms of the mental health part, it turns out that there's an epidemic of mental health problems in young people now, it's unprecedented levels of anxiety and depression, that somebody went into, a scientist from St. Louis went into a high school in Palo Alto and evaluated the kids, and 80% of the kids in this very high charging, high power high school in California, 80% reported very significant symptoms of anxiety, 54% of depression. Jean Twenge wrote an article last year saying that she studies generational differences. And she said that between 2012 and 2017, completely unprecedented spike in anxiety and anxiety-related problems in adolescence, which she thinks is maybe related to the particularly social media, to technology and social media. But all these arrows are pointing to the fact that particularly with adolescents, that they're not happy, that they're extremely anxious, they're chronically tired. And the challenge is this, that all your experiences affect your brain. The neuroscientists say that particularly for adolescents, they're sculpting their adult brain. And what we don't want is we don't want kids to feel chronically tired, overwhelmed, helpless, hopeless, which means a very low sense of control. Because we want them to be sculpting a brain that's healthy, that has a healthy stress response, that's not used to being chronically tired and chronically stressed. Because when you're chronically tired and stressed, it changes the brain in a way that makes it more likely that as you get older, you'll continue to have anxiety problems or you continue to have recurrent depression. So the more we study the effects of stress in the brain, the more we think we should really be thinking about it the way we think about concussions now. We think about these repeated blows to the head, where a few years ago we thought, well, that he got his clock wound and he'll be okay in a few days. And now we realize that when it happens over and over, it has a really bad effect. And so does chronic stress. So we want to be thinking about how we can help kids develop healthy brains. In our opinion, the most important outcome of childhood and adolescent is not where you go to college. It's sculpting a brain that's healthy, meaning a brain that when it's stressed can react in an emergency and respond well under stress, but that's not chronically stressed. And when you're chronically stressed, you have an important stressor and it just overwhelms you. And we don't want kids to feel chronically overwhelmed, chronically helpless, chronically hopeless. We want them to have this healthy sense of control.
One of the people who does some of the best research on this is a guy named Steve Meyer, who's out at the University of Colorado. And he had this really clever experiment with mice. And the mice were little cages, their tails are starting hanging out the back. And they put these electrical things on the back of their tail and then shock the Jesus out of them, right? So that's kind of a bad day for a mouse. And they can see this in the stress response. They actually train them that when the light goes on, then they're going to get shocked and their stress would go through the roof. But they train them, they put a little wheel in there. And if the light goes on, and I'm about to get shocked, but I can spin the wheel and make the shock stop. They learn this sense of a controllable shock. And it turns out that they then basically don't experience the stress because they know that in a bad situation there's something that they can do. Well, fast forward, they disconnect that little wheel, but nobody sends the memo to the mice. The light goes off, the shock happens, they spin the wheel. Their stress levels are really low because it's the perception of control. It's not necessarily being in control, but it's the perception that in a bad situation, there's something that I can do. So to Bill's point, this perception of control, we want kids from the youngest possible age to have it as much as they can because it's vitally important to managing or coping well with stress. And it's also really important for developing intrinsic motivation and also for performance. So kind of my half of this partnership, I'm a test prep geek, right? So I help kids take terrible tests like the SAT and ACT. Raise your hand if you like those. Scott, you don't count. And I have experienced over and over and over working with kids who are really bright, they're academic, they're well supported by the parents, they come and take they go and take the SAT for real, and things would go a little wonky. And they come back and say, well, the test was so much harder than what I did for practice. I thought, that's kind of weird. I mean, standardized tests have very few saving graces, but the typical one is, they're standardized, right? So that's kind of weird, right? So I decided that, hey, I'll go and take this test myself. So there I am, I'm probably 28, I'm sitting in a local public high school, a bunch of teenagers next to me, started eavesdropping on their conversation, like, what are they stressed out about? Thinking, are they okay? And for no particular reason, I checked my own pulse. 140 beats a minute. Well, that's odd. One, because I'm awfully good at standardized tests. I have very few skills, but that's one of them. And two, I don't have to go to college again. I'm 28, they don't want me back, right? So like, why am I stressed? And the reality, of course, is that stress, it's a reaction to Bill's point. It's my amygdala going off. It doesn't have to be rational, and it will just go off. The problem, though, is it affects performance. So one of the things we talk about in our book is something called the Yerkes-Dawes law, and it's just a performance curve. And the idea is if the stress is really, really low, typically so is the performance. If there's no downside for not writing a term paper, would anybody ever write a term paper? Right? If you play me in pretty much any sport, you're going to win, but you're not going to look very good because I'm not good enough to stress you out. But as the stress gets higher, the performance tends to go up. You should have butterflies before giving a public presentation or taking a math test or a big soccer game. And at some point, you're in an optimal state of arousal, excitement, or stress. But as the stress goes out even further, at some point, the performance starts to come down. And so the challenge is, how do we get ourselves, or more importantly, our kids, in a place of optimal arousal, where they're excited enough to do their best, but not so stressed that they kind of fall apart. My job as a test prep geek, or test prep therapist in many ways, is to sort of bring people back to the middle so they perform optimally rather than falling apart. I suspect there's more than one person out there who had the experience in school, probably more often in math or physics or chemistry, of having been really well prepared and then things kind of go flat the day of the test. Anyone ever underperform on a test ever? Yeah, it kind of happens, right? And it's important for you to know that there's actual science behind that. So we can talk about that in our book. The principal model of motivation, though, that we look at in our book is something called self-determination theory. This is pretty neat. It's Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. And self-determination theory looks at intrinsic motivation, internal motivation. And it's the idea that I'm doing something because I want to do it. I'm not doing it to make someone else happy. I'm not doing it to get an A. I'm not doing it to look cool. I'm doing it because it matters to me. And that's the ideal thing that we're trying to foster. And this is what Portfolio School is all about, how to get a love of learning and a love of making and a love of curiosity in kids, so that they're learning all the while, but they feel that they're playing, that they're doing things that are fun to them, for them. They're not doing it to impress somebody else. To be internally motivated, or to be intrinsically motivated, it's a really elegant model. It needs three things. You need a sense of competency, right? If you play most sports the way I do, you really don't want to do a lot of it. You need a sense of relatedness. Teachers are the most important ingredient in any good school system, because if the kids feel connected to their teachers, we get better intrinsic motivation. And then the third thing is autonomy. If you don't feel that the choices that you make a difference, if you feel like you have no say, then that whole thing falls apart. Now, I won't speak badly about any of the school systems here, but I can say in DC, there tends to be a little bit of an overemphasis on one of those three things. And it's the competency, right? We've got to push, push, push. I had a client call up the other day and said, so we're looking for a different math tutor for our daughter. I mean, her older brother's in the advanced math track, but we want to make sure she does the advanced math track, so it's really important when she gets around to college. And she's been doing this other tutor, but she's not really the right person. We're wondering, do you think 3 days a week of math tutoring is too much? I mean, because now that she's in 4th grade, right, my ears are bleeding. Like, what do you do with that, right? And all this mom can think about is the skills, the skills, the skills, the skills. But you take the relatedness, and God knows that the autonomy, just sort of drop kick it right out the window and hope this kid is going to want to do more of that. So for us, this model of self-determination theory is really important. And we got on a call with Edward Deci, who was one of the guys who founded this, and said it's our belief that of the three of these, competency, relatedness, and autonomy, this autonomy that's the most important. I said, is that true? That's our sense. And he said, yeah, if there's anything you're going to focus on, anything you try to foster, you really want to help kids feel that they have a say, that they have a sense of control, that they have autonomy, and it comes together a whole lot better. Really quickly, we also look at the great work of Carol Dweck, which I think most people are familiar with, that idea of a growth mindset, which for us is nothing more than a sense of control writ large. Doug and Barbara gave us a quick tour of Portfolio School, and we were listening at the end of the day to the socio-emotional part of the school day, and the lead teacher over there was talking to all these little kids and asked them, like, what was a good part of your day, how did you help, what was a challenge? And this one little girl raised her hand. She said, well, I was doing drawing. I was doing coloring. And she asked, well, why is that challenging for you? She said, well, I'm not very good at coloring. And of course, Dr. Dweck would say, as did her teacher, yet, right? You're not great yet. And so you simply hold out the possibility that anything that isn't going well can go well in the future with help, with practice. And therefore, it's simply not as threatening. It's okay where you are right now. And then the last person that we look at a lot is what's the idea of flow? And so flow is the idea of people being in a brain state where it's high challenge, it's low threat. This is where brains really work at their best, whether it's tennis or music or art and doing math, where kids are working at their absolute peak and on something that really matters to them. There's a guy named Reed Larson who talks about this, and he describes it as the passionate pursuit of pastimes. That particularly when you get to see kids who are in high school, so often they're doing schoolwork just to get the grade. And that's valuable to them short term, but it's extrinsically motivated. It's really not intrinsically motivated. If you have a story, do you want to tell a story about you and music?
Sure. I graduated from high school with a 2.8 grade point average, and I knew I only needed a 2.5 at that time to get into the University of Washington. I still kick myself for all that extra wasted energy I spent on school. But I turned in everything late. I don't think I ever finished a book until I was 19 years old. But I was passionate about rock and roll. And I was in a band, and I'd go in high school, I had a little practice room. I'd go to my practice room, and I'd tell myself, well, I'll do music for half an hour, and then I'll do a little homework. And invariably, I come out of my practice room 2.5 hours later and just have no idea what time it was, completely absorbed in trying to learn music. And what this flow state involves, it involves high energy, high attention, high focus, high effort, but low stress. And really, I think that I was able to sculpt a brain that can completely go pedal to the metal about stuff that's important to me, I think, through sports and through music. Even though I spent very little attention at all in my adolescent years on school. I think, and so when I see kids now who aren't really motivated for school, aren't doing well in school, but they're motivated for something, they work hard in something, I tell them, I don't worry about you, because I know that you're sculpting a brain that if school becomes important to you, or something else becomes important, you're going to know how to go pedal to the metal. And that's basically this idea that it's these twin scourges of stress-related problems and these motivational issues that really prompted Ned and I to write the book. And I'll just tell you about some of the stuff that we have come to recommend to parents. And early in my career, for the first 13 or 14 years, I did a lot of psychotherapy in addition to the testing that I still do. And I had experiences like, I can't tell you how many parents told me that they dreaded dinner time because they knew after dinner time it'd be like World War III fighting over a kid's homework. And I'd have, I see a lot of underachievers, I still do, and I always ask them, if you don't turn in an assignment, who's most upset? And invariably, the kid says, my mom. And so then I use a family therapy technique. I say, well, who's next most upset? And then it's my dad. Who's next most? My teacher. Who's next most? My tutor, my therapist, my sister, she hates the arguing. The kid's never on the list. And I really started to think there's something wrong with that picture, because what became clear to me early on was one of the most important things we want kids to have is a sense of who's responsible for what. I personally love the idea that from very early on, it's the kid's life. Well, one of the most beautiful things anybody ever said to me, I don't remember who it was, but when my kids were little, they said, one of the things I loved about raising teenagers is that every day when they come home from school, you get to see who they're deciding to be. And I just love that idea that somehow our role as parents, it's not to make our kids turn out a certain way. It's to help them who discover who they want to be and support that. And so in 1986, I had some of these experiences, and I used to do a lot of therapy with adults, and it was so common for a 35-year-old to say, I'd say, so how can I help you? And they say, well, I feel like I spent the first 35 years of my life trying to live up to other people's expectations, and I'm trying to figure out what's important to me. And so I thought that we can probably help people at a younger age than 35 figure out what's important to them. And so I wrote a couple papers in 1986 on homework. And I discovered in 1986 that after 60 years of research, nobody had been able to demonstrate that homework contributes to learning in elementary school. And it's still true now, after 90-some years of research, it's still true. And so I'd see all these knockdown, dragouts, all this incredible homework-related stress, and it doesn't contribute to learning. So I wrote a paper and a little article that got republished in all places of McCall's magazine. And it was just how not to fight with kids about homework. And my advice was, tell your kid, and this is the title of the second chapter of our book, tell your kid, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. And one of my clients was reading our book a couple months ago, and she sent me an email and she said, I just told my 8th grade boy, I love you too much to fight with you about your homework. And first he smiled, and then he hugged me, and they said, is something wrong with you, Mom? But the idea is that if you say, I'm not going to fight, you're the most precious thing in the universe to me. I don't want to fight with you about your work. And also, I mean, obviously, I couldn't make you do this work. I mean, and I think one of the most empowering things, for those of you who have young children, and in my experience, one of the most empowering things as a parent is recognizing you really can't make your kids do anything. Then you think about almost anything you could name. All they'd have to do is flop to the floor. I mean, you can pick them up and carry them to the car, but you can't make them go to the car. And if you realize that our job is not to force, and that forcing doesn't work, it's very empowering. So I basically, it's 32 years ago, I suggested, think about yourself in relation to homework, and it generalizes to other stuff too. But think about yourself as your consultant to your kid. Tell your kid, I'm not going to fight with you about it. I'm not going to act like it's my job to get you to do it or to get you to do it well. But I'm willing to do anything I can to help you. I'm willing to be your homework consultant. I'm willing to have my consulting hours from 6:30 to 7:30. If you need a tutor, I'm willing to get a tutor. But I'm not going to fight about it. And I'm not going to take on your responsibility, because I'll weaken you if I do. And we found this to be a very compelling idea. And it just works when people do it. It just works in part because years ago, one of my friends, who's also a neuropsychologist, did some training in a particular kind of psychotherapy. And he was taught, don't work harder to help your clients help themselves than they work, because you're going to weaken them, because they're going to be basically relying on you to solve their problems. And over the last 25 years, I've taught hundreds of tutors. I've trained hundreds of tutors, and I tell them, if it feels to you like you're working harder to help a kid than the kid's working, say, that something's wrong with this picture. I feel like I can't help you if it feels like I'm working harder than you are. So this consultant idea implies in part that we offer help. We don't try to force it. We offer advice. And one of the most empowering things you can do with kids is you say, would you like to hear my opinion about that? As opposed to just telling them, laying advice on them. You simply ask, do you want to hear it? Basically, that enforcing the sense of control. But one of my former colleagues moved to Florida and sent me a postcard that said, I want to give you some advice that my mother gave me, because I sure as hell won't be using it. And I think that Ned and I find that once we start thinking about that sense of control, that we just seek buy-in. We're always looking, we're trying not to force, we're trying not to just be another person laying advice on a kid that he doesn't want. So we're saying, is there some way I can help you with that? Is that something you want help with? You want to hear my opinion about that? I've got some advice. Would you like to hear it? And it's very empowering. Do you want to tell the Matthew story?
Yeah, the other mic doesn't work.
Oh.
Yeah, so I have my son, when he was in 5th grade, 6th grade maybe, my wife is sort of the academic in the family. She teaches Latin. It's a really geeky family. But she's one of these moms who's probably like a lot of people out there. I mean, super organized, right? She can handle her, just kind of schedule everything. And so she was helping my son with some homework assignment, and something had gone missing, something had not been done, something was amiss. And she turned and looked at him and said, well, why didn't you hand it in or do it or whatever? And he sort of froze. And he said, because you didn't remind me. So I'm in the middle of making dinner. I kind of run over like the guy in the timeout in the middle of a basketball game. And I looked at him and said, listen, pal, you do not throw your mother under the bus. Right. First of all, it's your responsibility to do 5th grade, in part because your mother's already done 5th grade, and you probably deserve the opportunity as well. And I looked at her and I'm like, sweetheart, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, of course, he said, I thought you'd remind me because you always have, right? And again, she's one of these people, she can organize my schedule, my son's schedule, her schedule, my daughter's schedule, Bill's schedule, Scott's schedule. She can probably handle the whole darn thing, right? She's that capable. I mean, that's who she is, in part because she has a fully developed prefrontal cortex, right? But just because she can, right, doesn't mean that she should, right? I mean, occasionally I get this from this dad the other day whose kid is wickedly ADD, and I've been trying to tell him just to be patient, and he finally looked at me and said, promise me, I mean, you're 100% sure he has a prefrontal cortex? Well, I'm not 100% doing these. But it's hard, right? It's hard because, as adults, we can see where we think these dominoes may go to. And we can, of course, do things more capably than can our children. But, again, if we do things for them, it doesn't make them stronger, it makes them weaker. And so a lot of the work is on ourselves, trying to sort of just be patient and let it go. So my wife and I worked really hard on giving my somewhat irresponsible son a lot of time and space to kind of do it on his own, and sometimes it went really well, and sometimes it didn't go well. I'm happy to report that his rehab counselor said he's doing great now as a junior. I'm teasing. But he's doing really well as a junior in high school now, in frankly doing better academically than I really would have felt comfortable to push him to. And it's just my job. I sit back, and every night, do you need help with any of that? No. Do you want me to quiz or anything? No. I'll let you know if you do. Perfect. First of all, I'm off the hook, which is awesome, right? Because it's a whole lot less stressful to be a consultant than to feel like you're responsible for someone else's behavior. I mean, that's a hard place to be. And I'll share with you that during, I guess it was halfway during his sophomore year, there was some sort of big school dance at my son's school, and he got invited to that party that's after the dance, like the first time, and again, really geeky family, so this was like a big deal, right? And so we're out for a walk, and he says, Dad, I have a question. I say, yeah, what's your question? So there's that party, like after the dance, yeah? I said, okay. He said, what do I do if I'm there and people are drinking alcohol? Now inside I'm like, I'm a great daddy. And right, those questions that you pray to God, right? I mean, seriously, that's the question that I want my son to ask. I don't want to fight with him about trigonometry, right? He's got a teacher for that. But for those things that are really important, we really want, relationship issues or what friends are doing that maybe they shouldn't be doing. We want our kids to come and have that conversation with us. But I earnestly believe that if we spend our social and emotional and personal capital on things like homework, then we're really not fostering the relationship that we want, where kids are going to come to us. Because when things go poorly, we really want our kids to come, to us rather than to avoid us. Now, this idea of being a consultant, the next chapter in our book is simply, and I swear we won't go through all 13 chapters, is the idea if it's your call. And when you say this to kids, you say it's your call. First of all, their stress response doesn't go off. You're having a conversation with their rational part of their brain. But we want to give to kids the idea that you have a brain in your head. You can make good decisions. And when you make decisions that aren't the right ones, that you have the ability to figure out the best situation there. Because to give your children, even at a young age, to voice confidence in their ability to think things through, to give them experience making decisions, and then it also forces them to really be honest with themselves about, is this a good idea or not a good idea? When they fight with us, they don't have to be honest. I'll tell this really quick story. I had a student I was working with who was taking a test applied to independent schools, an incredibly bright child. I mean, 25, 30 IQ points on me. I mean, crazy smart child. Also one of the most stressed out human beings I've ever met. And a mother with whom he just fought incessantly. And through this whole process, he decided he didn't want to take this test. Okay. And I said to him, look, no one can make you take the test. Again, I can't pull you up and duct tape you to a chair and make you take this stupid test. But here are the reasons why I think you should do it, blah, blah, blah. Mom comes into the situation. He says, Ned says I don't have to take that stupid test. And I'm like, point of clarification, Your Honor. Point of clarification. I didn't say you shouldn't. I said no one can make you, right? So we go through this. So then mom explodes. You're going to take that stupid test. I'm done with your crap, blah, 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 blah. And that just sends him through the roof, right? And so it's this Mexican standoff. This is not going to go well. And so I said, can you give me just a moment? I said, and I take him outside. I said, why don't you sit? I need to talk to your mom for just a moment, if I may. And I went back and I said, I can see how hard this is for you because I know this is important for you. I said, I'd like to suggest that we say to your son, it's your call. And I ran through the whole rationale for it. And I said, are you willing to try this? And she said, okay. And so we brought him back in. And I said, okay, Brian, no one's going to make you take the test. I've said my piece. I'm sure your mother said her piece on why we think this is a good idea for you to do it. But it has to be your call because we can't make you. So here's the deal. It's Tuesday. I want you to think about it. And on Thursday night, I will call you up, and you will tell me what your decision is. And as long as you tell me what your reason is, it's all good. And your mother has pledged right here, we have witnesses, that she's not going to fight you on it. It's your call. But you just have to tell me on Thursday, okay? Okay, he's almost shaking. He's so mad. When we shake hands, and he walks out the door. And about 7 minutes later, I get a text on my phone from his mom. Brian got in the car, said, how could you embarrass me like that, Mom? I'll take the stupid test on Thursday. Right? He knew that this was a worthwhile thing, but he resented like nobody's business the idea that he had to do it. But when we both stepped back and sort of took the sail out of his wind, right, there's nowhere else to blow, right? And he wanted to be successful. And I really think if you work on, particularly when your kids get to be older children, they get to be young adults, or teenagers and young adults, to recognize that they, like you, want to be successful. And to treat them like they have brains in their heads is an awfully good way to get started. Oh, do you want to tell a quick story about the kid getting ready for his... Oh,
sure, yeah. Ned and I talked at a school this spring, and one of them, a mother came up to me afterwards and said, you know, we're an observant Jewish family, and my kid doesn't want to do his bar mitzvah, and it's a really big deal in our family. And she said, you know, I can kind of predict what your advice would be, given that we just wrote this book about how important it is to tell kids, particularly adolescents, I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and to learn from your mistakes. And I want you to have tons of practice doing it. And I said, so my advice would be, tell him, it's really important to me, it's really important to your dad, it's important to your family. However, I respect you. And if this isn't the right time to do it, you don't want to do it, I can live with that. She said a couple of days later, he said, Mom, okay, I'll do it. And it doesn't always go that, but it usually does. When we treat kids respectfully, that they usually will come along and they treat us respectfully. Can I just add one thing before we talk about chapter 4? So one of the other aspects of this idea of being a consultant is we want kids as much as possible to solve their own problems. I've done exercises where I'll create a scenario and I'll ask the parent, a kid comes home and he just got, a girl come home from 3rd grade and didn't get invited to a birthday party or something like that. And I ask, whose problem is it? And it's very hard for us as parents not to leap in and act like it's our problem. And what we find though, what all the science finds, is that when kids have the experience of resolving a stressful situation themselves, it changes their brain in a way that makes them resilient because they go into coping mode as opposed to giving up or feeling helpless. So even when it's a really big disappointment, one of my clients apparently is a 2nd grader. She was in school, and the teacher said, "What's the largest number in the world?" And this kid said, 23,000. And the teacher said, "Well, what about 23,001?" And the kid said, "I was so close." Major, right. Whose problem is it? Yeah.
Now, this idea of putting sort of more control and more decisions in your children's hand it's not easy, right? It's not easy because the reason you're all sitting here on the Monday evening spending some time with us is you love children, your children, other people's children, and you want the best for them. And of course, you can anticipate the future in the ways that they can't, and so it can be hard to let go a little bit. So we have a whole chapter in the book called A Non-Anxious Presence. And this is a term we got from a guy named Edwin Friedman, who was a rabbi and a business consultant. And he worked with churches and synagogues and schools and corporations and families, all these kind of little corporate units. And he made the point that things go much better when the leader, whoever he or she is is not overly reactive, is not emotional, is not fear-mongering, in part because if I as a leader am really intensely emotional, it will affect all the people around me in part because their amygdala start going off. I mean, if you've ever been on the subway, right, and somebody sits down to you who is just like this, right, they're not upset with you, they started out upset, they sat down upset, they're gonna leave upset. It's not about you, but you sit there and you feel it, right? And so the challenge with children is if we get anxious or we get upset near them, they have a very high likelihood of thinking that we're anxious or upset with them or at them. And that's hard, right? The other thing is I have, at least in the work that I do, kids who, a test didn't go well, they're really anxious about college, whatever it happens to be. If something's gone splat and maybe put a little challenge in the plan that they have, and then they go, oh no, and then they realize, I have to go home and share this information. My dad's gonna kill me, my mom's gonna flip her lid. And to me, it's hard, in part because I think there's nobody in the world who knows more about you, who loves you more, who cares more about you, certainly who's going to invest, overpriced test prep resources, than your parents. And you want to take that problem and run to anyone but them. So that's kind of a challenge. To a brain chemistry perspective, there's this guy named Michael Meany who did this great research with rat pups. So pups are baby rats. And so they took these baby rats, and basically from the moment they were born, they whisked them away, and these lab techs sat there with like the little latex gloves and sort of handled them like this. And so these like blind little, hairless pups would go, what the heck? This is really stressful. And they could see the cortisol just go through their head, and they're just having a really hard time of it. But after about a half an hour, if they bring the pups back to mom, and mom is what's described as a high licking and grooming rat, which is sort of like lots of loves and kisses, and they're those bad researcher people, whatever. And they spend time with mom, high nurturing, the cortisol just flows right out of them. And they totally recover and they forget whatever bad thing that there was. Now Meany did this neat thing where he went back and forth from like, to super high stress to like no stress, over and over and over and over. And it wired their brains in ways that were profound, so that the prefrontal cortex ended up having perfect regulation of the stress response. These rats were almost impossible to stress as adult rats. In fact, the researchers gave them the name California laid-back rats, right? Now, the thing that's interesting about this, you have to recognize these rat moms did not run in there like a SWAT mommy rat team, right, and rescue the pups, right? They didn't send in some overpriced consultant to solve the situation. All that they did is when these pups came back and they're sitting there upset and stressed out, they just love them. Which is kind of like, really? And I don't know about you, but the world that I live in feels like it has more than enough stress. And I always get a little anxious sometimes, thinking about my kids going out and what they have to face, sometimes on their own during the day. But the reality is, we can't put our kids in a cocoon. We can't put them in a bubble. We can't protect them from stresses, with friends or school or, whatever's going on, CNN at this very moment. But if we can be a non-anxious presence ourselves so that our kids go out into this adventure and then come back and we're super, super low stress, it actually wires their brains in ways that are profound. In fact, what they found was, in addition to being almost impossible to stress, these rat pups developed all the attributes that we want our kids to have as learners, that they were principally curious. And they test this by rats, because their prey will always go around the periphery of any space. And they put all the food and the wheels and the maker space right out there in the middle of the cage. And these rats that were nurtured to be high licking and grooming rats would venture around and go, hey Bill, let's go check that out. There's some maker stuff out there. We should go play with that. And that's what we want our children to be, is to know that they can come back and let home be a safe base and fully recover, so they then have the energy or the courage to go out and explore in ways, even if it might be a little bit stressful on a day-to-day basis.
And so, I mean, in some ways, the bad news is that stress is contagious. That whether if a mom and a baby, the mom is stressed, the baby's stress hormones go up, and same thing in couples. A kid in the classroom has a burned out teacher, the kid's cortisol levels, the stress hormone levels go up. But it's also true that calm is contagious. This Michael Meany did another study where he had a colony of rat mothers who were these very high licking grooming, who were non-anxious. and very hard to stress. And he had a colony of mothers who were anxious, easily stressed, and those mothers did very little licking and grooming. And he fostered offspring from the low licking and grooming to the high licking and grooming. And those pups turned out to be California laid-back rats too, even though they're genetically programmed to be anxious. And so it's a beautiful thing. And the thing is, I mean, I tested the son of a humorist 30-some years ago who said that we really shouldn't call it raising children. We should call it lowering parents, because it's hard, and kids, thank God, kids don't need perfect parents. But what I was just reading about infants. So infants, what they need is they need warmth and responsiveness. And it's hard to think of a time in our life when if things aren't going well or we're stressed, we don't benefit from warmth and responsiveness. And I'll mention too that it's very common for me to meet with parents and if they have a kid who's not doing well. And they'll be telling about the kid's problems, and then one of the parents will break into tears and will say, "I just want him to feel good about himself." And after they stop crying, I say, "I think we're going to be much better able to help him feel good about himself if we aren't worried sick." The idea, if we want the kid to feel it's okay to be where you are now, it's easier to convey that if we aren't worried sick about it. And so, and we see so many highly anxious kids, and I just think it's just counterintuitive to us as parents to think that one of the things that we can do is to be the most helpful to help our kids with anxiety is to lower our own. And so that we think, and in our chapter we talk about various ways that parents can move in this direction. We just set as a goal of being a non-anxious presence for a kid. And a lot of the DC area, they say, good luck with that. But it's possible. And do you want to talk about some of the ways people do it, or do it? Well, just, I mean, one of the things we talk about is do you want to do it?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I'll go back to Yerkes Dodd for just a moment. I mean, so much of the work that I do, again, is trying to pull kids in. And I mean, I'll have experience with the kids will come in with what they or their parents feel like are the lowest PSAT scores in the history of time, right? And I'll tend to look at the scores and be like, well, it looks to me like you missed some that you probably knew how to get. And we'll go through and do a couple problems and not catastrophize over it. And that energy makes an enormous difference. I mean, in part because you can't fake being a non-anxious presence, right? I mean, if my stress reaction is going off, it's going to affect Bill. There are also these things called mirror neurons, which is kind of how we understand one another. So if you have like a really good friend, and you go out and have coffee with her, and you can see that she's, a little upset, our brains sort of dance in unison to try to figure out what the person is feeling. And so, if your son or daughter comes home, has had just a really rough time of it, and in the back of your head you're thinking, and you're looking like, don't worry, sweetheart, it's going to be fine, right? Do kids believe what they are being told, or do they believe what they're actually experiencing? And part of the things that are really stressful to us, for anyone who has children, is that when things aren't going well, we tend to extrapolate and assume that where that kid is now is where he or she is going to be forever. And you think these 2 points make a line. Well, of course, lines do this, right? And I think everyone here in the audience has had experiences where things were really not going well, and you thought, boy, if I were stuck there forever. But it bounced back. Or we have friends or family members who really struggled. And so part of the challenge is believing that growth is linear. If a kid is ahead of my kid, if my kid's behind, if my kid is a C+ student in 7th grade, that somehow he's going to have a C+ life. But we know that that's not the case. I mean, take simple things like, the kid who's the tallest boy in 7th grade who hits his growth spurt early. Enjoy it now, pal, right? Because we know that's not going to be the biggest kid by the time you get to senior year of high school. And so it's particularly hard when kids are suffering, not just academically, but really kind of an emotional level or mental health level. And one of the things that makes it much easier for Bill and me to convey confidence to all sorts of families, even when things are really going poorly, is that we've had so many experiences with kids who are really having a heck of a hard time in 3rd grade, in 5th grade, in junior year, when they flunked out of college. but we kind of hang with them, and then 3 years or 5 years or 10 years later, they are successful in ways that no one really would have predicted, and they're not sort of precocious, they end up being post-cocious. And so having that, kind of taking that long view makes it much, much easier if you just assume that where they are right now is just sort of part of the process. And I guess I'll overshare a little bit. I had my father's an alcoholic who eventually drank himself to death, and my mother struggled a lot with her own mental health. So I spent about 3 months of 7th grade in a pediatric psychiatric hospital, which, if you can remember back to being 7th grade, was not really like the really cool. That wasn't where the cool kids were in 7th grade. So that was a little rough. And I came back to school and I was really apprehensive because how is this going to work out? And it fortunately my life has been successful in ways more than I would have possibly imagined. But one of the things in those moments, my parents were both having a really hard time, which is kind of why I was having a hard time. But some of the people who made a profound difference to me were teachers who probably had experience with kids struggling as well. And they weren't worried about where I was right now. They weren't worried about my grades. They were interested in me as a person. So if you have a kid who's really struggling, one of the highest value things you can possibly do is just to enjoy your kid for your kid and nothing more. Let the grades and everything else be darned. So I remember walking back into 7th grade. It was like, some bad John Hughes movie. Actually, they're all good, weren't they? All of his movies were good. And I walk in there, and I was a math kid, right? And so my favorite teacher was Miss Greenberg, and I was like 3 months of undone homework assignments, and I was expecting I was going to walk in, and she'd give me the eye like, Mr. Johnson, where is your home? Because I thought that she liked me because I was so good as a math student in her class. And it never occurred to me that she just liked me. So I open the door and I sort of tentatively stick my head in, and she looks up from her desk, and her eyes, her face smiles widely, and she simply says, Ned, how are you? And it could have been a puddle right there on the floor. And it's enormously helpful. So for all of you who are teachers, and also if you have kids when they're struggling, it's so hard when things are going poorly not to feel like we should somehow be disapproving of the fact that things are going poorly. But we can be unhappy with the circumstances or the performance. But if you make it a really high value to simply love your kid wherever he is, you're doing an enormous work towards being a high licking and grooming parent. Anyway.
I think that in this chapter, there's a bunch of other suggestions about how we can move in that direction of being a non-anxious presence. But those two of taking that long view, just in the last 2 weeks, I got my daughter went to a party and met somebody who I did therapy with, parents and a kid, literally 30 years ago. And they said, I want Bill to know that the two boys who I saw, who were 41 and 37, are doing great. And I also got a call from somebody who I tested when he was 7, who he was really smart, just had very bad dyslexia. And I kept trying to reassure the mother that he'd be fine, and she was just so anxious. At one point I said, well, okay, I'll level with you. The likelihood is he'll end up working at McDonald's. And she didn't know if I was serious or not, and she finally figured I wasn't. We laughed about it, and then 25 years later we were laughing about it again. It's very powerful. And this idea of just, when I used to do therapy with families, I'd say, let's set the highest goal of our work together, being able to enjoy your kid. Because when you enjoy kids spontaneously, they experience themselves as joy-producing organisms rather than frustration or anxiety-producing organisms. It's a good thing. And we have 2 chapters in our book about what we call radical downtime. And we think about, the idea is that our culture, we are so friggin' tired and so busy, and our kids are so tired and so busy that we need more radical downtime. And we talk about radical downtime as when you're apparently doing nothing, and it includes daydreaming or mind wandering, meditation, and sleep. And the daydreaming part, that the kids now, that they have so little time where they aren't plugged in electronically, to actually just let their mind wander. And there's extensive research on the value of mind wandering for creativity, for problem solving, and for young people developing a coherent sense of identity and a capacity for empathy. That you have to have time to reflect on your life and your relationships to develop empathy, and to develop a sense of identity. And we both practice meditation. We both practice Transcendental Meditation. I've practiced TM for 44 years. And I've done a fair amount of research on TM and have found that, particularly for younger adolescents and older adolescents, very powerful way to lower stress and improve mental functioning. And so we have a chapter in the book. And in my first pilot study of kids with ADHD practicing TM, that we got really good data, but we also interviewed the kids. And all the kids said that after 3 months of meditating twice a day, that they were much less anxious and they could focus better. And this one kid who was wildly impulsive, he said, before I started meditating, if I was walking in the hall and somebody bumped me, I just turn around and hit him. But now that I've been meditating, if I'm walking in the hall and somebody bumps me, I stop and think, should I hit him or not? Which we thought was tremendous improvement. I just saw a kid the other day whose brother. Younger brother was in 6th grade, and I met with him. I tested him a year earlier, and I was supposed to meet with him to kind of remind him how capable he was, because he was really depressed and he's really down on himself. And I met with him and his therapist, who was the best therapist in the whole DC area. And the kid cried during most of our session because he felt that he'd let down his teachers and let down his parents. And his parents said, is there anything that he could do? He's got the best therapist in the city. He's on medication. And I said, well, you could try learning meditation. So I called the mother about 9 months later. I don't remember why I called her. And I said, so how is he doing? She said, God, he's had an incredible 7th grade year. He's done really well. He's happy. And I said, did he ever learn to meditate? She said, yeah, he's been doing it all year. And I said, oh my God, maybe that's why. That was at least partly the explanation why I did so well. So we're big fans of meditation, and the sleep part is just ridiculously important. And you want to talk about the sleep part?
Bill and I were back there in the sort of green room and talking about what we're going to say here a little bit, and they talk about there's sometimes stereotypes about New York. Maybe the New Yorkers are kind of a little bit of a hurry, sometimes a little bit short with people who are driving badly or get a little impatient perhaps. And they're also they sometimes say that New York is the city that never sleeps, and we're thinking, is there a correlation there? I mean, it's probably just that cranky people don't like to sleep. I'm sure that's how that works. I mean, the thing about sleep, there's just volumes and volumes and volumes, and all the scientific literature and the insights about sleep are consistent and compelling and grim. But the kind of two big takeaways. One is that the effects of sleep on the brain look very, very close to the effects of stress on the brain. So if you're already stressed, to amplify that with sleep deprivation just makes it awfully hard for you. When people are clinically depressed, many of them have problems with sleep. If they can fix the sleep, for about half of those people, the depression just gone. From a performance perspective, I talk with students about this because they really don't care about old people stuff. But I explained to them, I had this boy I was working with the other day, explaining to him that sleep deprivation really, because it amplifies about 60% more reactive, more cortisol, your amygdala is firing, your prefrontal cortex kind of goes sideways. So all the things that matter to you, it's harder to do when your brain is tired. And I also made mention that your amygdala, again, the stress reactor, is more intense. I said, here's an easy example. Have you ever noticed how when you're really tired, you kind of feel like the world is out to get you, like everyone's cranky, everyone's impatient? I said, do you ever notice when you're tired, your mom is even more annoying than normal? And he's this wicked, sharp kid, and he sits there and goes, my God, I must be tired all the time. He's funny. She hit him. He deserved it. But it's a challenge, because we certainly are in a culture that where people sort of like to brag about how little sleep that they get. But for me, it's just, almost every week I work with a kid where things have gone poorly on a test, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about sleep and what time they go to bed and blah, blah, blah. And it always ends up with, oh, and where does your cell phone sleep? What do you mean? Well, at night, where's your cell phone? In my bedroom. Why? I'm so glad you asked. And then I launched into the whole thing about how, all the science your cell phone should be charging in your bedroom. Sorry, in the kitchen, not in your bedroom. And then the Hail Mary, of course, of a desperate teenager is, but I use it for my alarm clock. To which I somewhat unhelpfully reply, my hunch is you use your mom for your alarm clock, and you're probably using your cell phone for everything but your alarm clock. Oh, and by the way, because a lot of kids I work with are going to, expensive independent schools, so they're paying $40,000 a year for that or whatever it is, and way too much money for my help, and nobody in your life, including your nana, can come up with $20 for a proper alarm clock? So I have Amazon Prime. Yep, and so every week I buy a kid an alarm clock. I got a purple one in my bag if anyone wants an alarm clock. It's an extra one. So I know it's hard because we're all busy, but for me, I kind of work on the assumption of what's an appropriate amount of sleep, what's a healthy amount of sleep. For me, 56 hours, 7 times 8. Figure out how you're going to get that 56 hours sleep and then spend the rest of your time rather than letting sleep be whatever you do with whatever's left of your day. Because, the science is so clear that everything that you care about, from athletic performance to verbal retrieval to emotional control, everything is better when you're more well-rested, including SAT scores. So there's that.
So we'll just take 5 minutes and finish up here and take your questions. But the last two chapters in the book, the last are called, one's called Who's Ready for College, and one's called Alternate Routes. And both chapters are in part about what we consider, at least where we live, and probably where you live too, the narrow and really unrealistic view that many kids grow up with about how you become successful in the world and what success feels like as adults. I was talking to a group of an AP 11th grade English class at an elite high school a few years ago, and I was talking about, they wanted me to talk about the effects of stress and sleep deprivation on the brain. And so I talked to them, and they had a million questions, and they were attentive. And the teacher came up and whispered in my ear afterwards. She said, they all think it's either Yale or McDonald's. And we get this a lot, where people think that kids think that the most important outcome of their whole life, up to age 18, is where they go to college. And we think it's pretty useful to tell kids that there's advantage to going to elite college. But the research suggests that it doesn't really make very much difference in terms of how successful you are, how much money you make, how satisfied with your life, how happy you are. And I think that we try to give kids a sense that the paths to success are quite broad in the sense that kids grow up thinking that the straight-A students are going to be more successful. Well, we know the valedictorians, by the time they're 25, aren't really more successful than other college graduates. I myself, in the alternate routes, we talk about people who became successful even though they screwed up or they never finished college. And I myself, I got myself out of college into the top PhD program in English in the country at Berkeley. And I went for 2 quarters and for 20 weeks, and I flunked out because I didn't turn in a single assignment. When I work with underachievers now, I say, top that, 20 weeks, nothing. I set the bar high. But I just think that, because I see so many kids who are struggling in school, when I tell them that I flunked out of graduate school and then I got fired from a job typing, which wasn't confidence inspiring, it helps them understand that you can still create a really meaningful life, even if you aren't always a top student, even if things don't always go well.
With the marijuana. I don't want to name the school. The kids in the pie at school.
Oh, yeah. So part of what we talk about in the chapter on Who's Ready for College is we want kids to really understand, and parents to understand, when kids are going up to college, what it's really like. And at Yale, this past year, more than 50% of the undergraduates sought mental health services, and a third of those had serious suicidal ideation. And you can tell a little bit about the Williams situation, but I saw this kid, I consulted with this kid who I followed for several years, who went to a major, really prestigious university as a freshman. And he told me that he was basically almost flunking out. And he told me that he and all his friends and all the kids from his fraternity, that they binge drink 4 nights a week and smoke pot 7 days a week. And he was trying to convince his parents that the reason he wasn't doing well was because of his ADHD. That's a hard sell. But did you want to?
Yeah, and so Many of you have kids who are, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're thinking college is a long way away. Oh, yeah.
So a couple months ago, I tested the second grader. And as part of my interview, I said, are there things you worry about? She said, well, I'm worried about my grades because I know that my grades will reflect where I go to college. And I want to go to a good college. I want to go to American University because they have an elevation burger and I just love their fries.
Which is great. Which is great. I mean, yeah, no, right. For the reason we wrote this book is we work with so many children, and Bill works more with younger kids than do I, but younger kids become older kids. And there's really an epidemic, particularly when you get to high school and college. I mean, we see so many kids who work so hard and they get to college and they don't persevere in college because of the mental health issues that they've developed by being too stressed for too long all the way through high school. I just had my 25th college reunion, and my class gift, I went to Williams College, is to create the Center for Mental Well-Being, because the amount of mental health, principally anxiety at Williams, is so off the chart that they can't hire enough psychologists. Now, if you don't know, Williams College is the very northwest corner of Massachusetts. It's 2,000 people. By college standards, it's tiny, and it has almost limitless resources. So the idea that a school that is that small, with that many resources, can't staff to the mental health issues, to me is a bit of a canary in the coal mine. And so for us, I mean, even though the work that I do is helping kids be successful, getting into college, for us the most important work for anyone who has a child or works with children is to think about what fosters a healthy brain. Because we want kids to be resilient. We want them to be intrinsically motivated. We want all these kids to be as successful as they can possibly be, but we want that when they get there, they're actually able to enjoy the success and they don't have brains that have basically been scarred by anxiety and depression. And so, again, coming full circle, for us, the core to this, from everything that we've been able to research, and certainly from our own experiences, is to foster in children a sense of control. This doesn't mean putting them in control for everything, because you don't want to have kids be in charge of things that are overwhelming. But it's as much as it's ever possible to have kids feel that they have choices, that they have autonomy, that they get to run their lives to whatever degree they can. It's wiring a brain that's intrinsically motivated and that's resilient to stress. And those really have to be the dominant models for being successful in this life, wherever people choose to take themselves. So I want to thank the Portfolio School for having us. We certainly enjoyed the tour over there. It's a wonderful school, and we think that schools like the Portfolio School are ones that are really trying to foster this learner-directed learning, and they're developing curiosity, they're developing young brains that want to engage in an authentic way. And they're developing not just academic skills, but the kind of healthy brains that we think are so important, and we think we need to have more of in the world. We appreciate you all for being here. I know that you guys are from all over the city, and I hope that you'll take some of these messages with your own families, your own schools. Thank you very much for having us. We'd love to take questions.
Okay. So there are 2 mics over here, guys. So come up with your questions. Hopefully this will be a good discussion. I'll kick it off with a question myself. Whenever there are 2 authors or more than one, I always... Oops, I wasn't thinking of sitting in the middle, but that's fine. Yeah. How did you guys meet and decide to write this book?
Well, one of the people, we have a mutual colleague who's a college counselor and who's been in DC area for about 30 years. And what was happening, and Bill's been on the scene longer than I have, but I think it initially started with, we had a number of mutual clients where Bill had done the testing, I was then working with the kids, and I would have questions because I really didn't know what was on this in neuropsych evaluations. And then we started doing some lecturing together, talking about motivation. And as Bill would say, the more time we spent together, the more we realized we kind of liked one another's thinking and started wanting to write some of this stuff down. I will share really quickly that what may be probably the best advice ever given from a college counselor, our friend Kathleen O'Connor, who's just amazing. And she says, I've been a college counselor for more than 30 years, and I give this advice to people over and over, and they never believe me, but it's still, I do believe, true. And this is important, that whom you marry matters much, much more than where you go to college. So if you're going to really obsess about anything, maybe work on those play dates and really get those right. So,
And I'll add that, I've been, the way that we describe, the way we recommend kind of child rearing in our book is just what I did with my kids. I mean, a lot of the stuff I've been talking about for 30-some years, and it just works. I mean, what I loved is that Ned had this reputation as being this guy who was just magical with adolescents, and he turned around their test scores. And the more I got to know him, to realize that it's because he didn't say this is so important. You got to work your butt off on this. He focused on stress reduction. He focused on sleep. He focused on encouraging kids and helping them feel safe. And so I love the fact that the same stuff that works with kids who have learning disabilities or anxiety disorders or autism, some of that stuff that I work with the kids that Ned works with.
That's fantastic.
Hi. First of all, I'm so happy you're doing this work. I think it's really important. And second of all, my background is in neuroscience as well, and so I'm sure you know, about 90% of neural architecture is kind of set up before 3. So when we're going to talk about changing brains and structuring brains and making sure we have healthy brains, and even the Meany study, that was sort of my interpretation of it is how important early experiences are. And so sometimes, can you speak a little bit to how early education and even the perinatal period, in terms of your stress response system and how that ends up wired, how can we sort of encourage parents and caregivers to take these lessons to heart before we test them for the SAT? Sure,
and this is the great challenge because certainly the times that the brains are most susceptible to stress are prenatally and in adolescence. And I think that when the brain is developing fast, and it's hard to talk about this because it can make parents feel guilty if they have stressful pregnancies or that they're stressed early on. But just knowing this, that my major goal for writing the book was to give parents a foundation so that they didn't have to be fearful about their kids and they didn't have to feel that they had to be on their kids all the time. And I think that we know that I think it's 40% of the cortisol, the major stress hormone in a mother's system during pregnancy, goes across the placenta and affects the baby, and certainly it affects the baby's stress response. And the baby's early experiences, sort of feeling that the security of attachment affects the stress reactivity in a baby. So as a society, if we could do anything differently, I would recommend that we really support mothers who are pregnant, mothers and other caregivers of young children, because the kids pick up on our stress. And we pick up on theirs too, but young kids and developing brains are the most susceptible to the effects of stress.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm a mom of a teenager who is in the audience as well. I recently read this really great book. I forgot his name, but he's a Harvard professor, and he wrote this book on Happier. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's from Israel, taught this really popular class at Harvard, and everyone wants to take it. And he basically also had a chapter on the rat race mentality and how that's so enforced in people, having to perform with this future goal in mind versus cultivating happiness as the ultimate currency. So I was wondering whether your thoughts on that, because I really felt like, had I, learned about that earlier when I was younger, and now that I have a 15-year-old myself, what you said earlier about just, enjoying children for who they are and, joy-giving organisms, and if they go through struggles, just, chill for a little bit and just see how it goes. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, the whole rat race mentality that's still being enforced in children, because I heard a lot about SET tests, and I'm like, whoa, versus the ultimate currency. So what do you think?
Well, it's a great question, and so there's a lot to that. I mean, certainly one of the things that sort of leaves me with my head in my hands is some of these families with whom I work, who have, everything. They're billionaires. They have everything in the world, except for peace and happiness.
Yeah.
Other than that, they got it covered, right? And so a lot of this is really kind of what's going on with brains, right? And a huge amount of therapy with working with people is really changing things from I have to I want to,
I want to.
right?
Yeah.
And I want to, right? And so it's hard to talk people out of this is what I want. You can't make people not want what they want or want what they don't want. But what we're trying to do is help people reframe things, almost like CBT, so that it isn't fear-based, right? I mean, there's so many kids feel that if I don't get into this group of colleges, that I'm never going to have anything, right? And so it's a conversation to help shift their thinking on that a bit. In terms of the rat race, I mean, we want people to work hard, but what we don't want people to do is work hard 24/7. We sort of talk about the idea of work hard, rest hard. Work hard, rest hard. And it's really easy for kids that work, if you talk about from an athletics perspective, if you sat there and ran, 10 miles every single day, you don't get better as quickly as you do as if you run, recover, recover. And so it's the same thing with brains as with nervous systems. I mean, a healthy stress response responds intensely to something that's real stress. But then what we want to do is to come right back down to zero. It's when people stay in this elevated state where their brains are just bathed in cortisol, you shrink the hippocampus, principal memory center of your brain, shrink the prefrontal cortex, all those executive functions, grow your amygdala, your stress response, and make it more hyperactive. Mm-hmm. And so it's just not a brain that can ever really relax and be healthy. So it depends on what the context. I mean, we all are always responding to the context that we're in. And so I don't try to talk people out of working hard, but just try to say there's this balance. And the easiest way is if you really want to get the most out of this, where's the rest going to be? I mean, even like professional athletes, the great frontier right now is these people hiring sleep experts. Because they know that when they're more well rested, they get more out of the workouts, and they're more successful as professional athletes.
And I'll mention, too, that when my kids were little, I had just been reading about the very low correlation between grades and success in adult life. And I told my kids that I'll look at their report cards if they want me to, but I didn't really care very much. What I cared about was their developing themselves so that they had something useful to offer the world. And that included developing themselves academically, but I didn't really care very much about their grades. When my daughter was in high school, her friends were all being offered A's for $100 for an A. I offered her $100 for a C so that she could have the experience that it wasn't that big a deal. And so, but both we use this model in our book. I raised both my kids this way, and my daughter got a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago when she was 26. And my son, who has learning disabilities and had ADHD, and was always had to be in a kind of a special ed program in school. He got a PhD when he was 30 in psychology as an incredibly effective consultant. And neither one of them had any academic pressure at all. Neither of them didn't have homework until in 5th grade, and bless the portfolio school, they really get this homework part. It's wonderful. They really realize that the research says it doesn't benefit. Why would we do it? But it just works. If we trust that kids want to be successful, they want to create something useful in this world. They want to contribute to this world, and that's what we want to support, as opposed to this idea of you got to be better than this person or this person. It just works.
Hi. I had a question specifically about applying youth theories, but in parenting kids, like from the age of 1.5 to 4, because they're unable to articulate how they feel and what they want, and yet they do know what they feel and what they want. So it's like that weird age where they can't tell you, but they have preferences. Yeah. And I can imagine how stressful that is for them when they you want them to get in the stroller and they don't, and there's no comprehension of why that has to happen. How do you take some of the stuff you guys were talking about and apply it in those cases?
So part of it is that we want to minimize the extent to which we force. And again, when my kids were in preschool age, and if I asked them to do something, they didn't want to do it, I'd literally say, you're acting like I think I could make you do it. And I say, I can't make you do it. And then I'd say, all you'd have to do, you could flop on the floor. You could close your eyes. You could walk into the bathroom and lock the door. I'd prescribe all these ways that if I tried to make them, they'd beat me. And it's very empowering. They always, when I just said, I can't make you do this, they were always willing to go along with me. And I think that's one thing. Also, from the time they're pretty little, that we can give kids choices. From the time they're 2, we can argue, do you want to do it this way or that way? And we wanted that, when my son was 3, there's a wonderful mother who loved to feed him and say, eat more. And I said, well, let's give him the message that you're the expert on you. So when he was 3, we were saying, you're the expert on you, because nobody really knows other than you when you're hungry and when you're full. And I want you to eat until you're full and then stop. And so there's ways that even with young children to give them choices. And also that it's so much of our worry and our fear, and many of my colleagues that I work in my practice have young children, and there's a lot of anxiety. You know, the kid doesn't look at you all 100% of the time. They're worried that this is autism, and it's so much of our fear, as Ned was saying earlier. It's related to this idea that somehow they're going to get stuck in some negative place and never grow out of it. I remember getting a call from an attorney I worked with years ago who had a 3-year-old, and she said he's just really fearful of the pipes in our apartment, you know, the plumbing pipes in the apartment. Is that normal? And I said, well, it's not normal in the sense that most kids aren't afraid of the plumbing pipes, but is it normal for kids to have, for 3-year-olds to have fears? It's absolutely normal for 3-year-olds to have fears. And so, any other thoughts, Ned?
Well, part of it too is, can you hear me? No, it's not working. I think I broke it. I mean, part of it, unless you're a developmental psychologist, and I am not, I think it can be hard that we have oftentimes we try to have conversations with kids that you know, an adult conversation with a 3-year-old as though the 3-year-old is rational. 3-year-old's not rational, so you try to try to convince them, and so sometimes we're just responding to their emotion. I remember watching this friend of mine. Her son was asked. She wanted like an ice cream sandwich or something out of the freezer, and so mom opens up the ice cream sandwich and hands it to him, and said, "No, that one." And the mom's like, well, no, they're the exact same thing, and starts saying, you should take this one because this one's the same as that one. And I'm thinking, who's being childish here? If they're the same thing, give them that choice. Because for me, I don't think kids need to have choice about everything. But if they feel like, whether it's true or not, if they feel like they have choice nowhere, then they start to pitch fits over things that don't matter at all. So I suspect, and some kids are much more easygoing than others. Some kids are much harder. People are born with their own temperaments. But I think part of it is we as parents, if we're attentive, we can see where the stressors are, and if we can give kids more control here or more choice there, we sort of let off some of that steam, and so later on they're probably more likely to go along with us. And my son is basically the personality of a golden retriever puppy, and my daughter's she's just super easygoing. And my daughter's first complete sentence with subject, verb, and object is "I do it." Said "I do it," like really, and you're like, okay, right? So it's a different model. It's a different model with her.
I tested a girl a couple years ago whose first words were "no way." But the other point about young children, and this may be the most important in addition to sleep, is that mammals play. And what's happened with young children now is that they spend so much more time in structured activities like soccer, starting at age 2 or at age 3, and engage in electronics. And I think that we want young children to play and to engage in dramatic play, in rough and tumble play with their boys. That it's just the most that human beings, the young of all mammal species, they play. That's how they learn. That's how they manage stress. That's how they learn to be adults. And the kids play much less than they used to. And schools that foster play, it do very well.
So I'll ask the next question. One of the phrases that I loved about in your book was safe to trust kids. And, I think it was in the context of, all right, we read this book, we attend this lecture, and go home and now start to pull away from our kids. And what happens inevitably is that, we expect them to take charge and start doing things, right, the right way. But it doesn't automatically happen, right? So there may be like 2 days, a week, a month, some time where, letting them go and do it on their own is stress-inducing in parents because they're not doing the right thing. So what should parents do in that situation?
Well, I mean, ultimately, parents shouldn't do things that they don't feel comfortable. I mean, if you have your own belief system as parents, you need to work within what your rules are, what your family beliefs are. Again, for me, I would say I would take the long view on this. Surprisingly, this is and I give you guys credit. Usually, the first question, if not the second, but certainly by heavens, the third question is always about technology. But maybe that's because you guys have little guys. But what about And so the scourge of this past year for anyone who has boys, particularly adolescent boys, is the game called Fortnite. You've probably seen this to 47 women who have filed for divorce because their husbands are using Fortnite too much. So this kind of ran through my family as well. And my son had a day off from school. This is in the spring of his sophomore year. Had a day off from school, and I asked him on Thursday night. I said, "So what are you going to do with your day tomorrow?" And he's like, "Play Fortnite." And I'm like, "Okay, that's good. What else?" "I'll think about it." I'm like, okay, so this doesn't strike me as the right thing. How about practice piano? How about go for a run? Whatever. Clean your room, whatever. So I come home on Friday. I go off to work, come back Friday, 6 o'clock. There's my son in front of his computer playing Fortnite, still in his pajamas, mind you, right? I'm a little hot. I've been at work all day. I'm like, seriously, pal? But I say nothing. I just look like, can you please get dressed? Because I would like to go out for pizza. But I say nothing more than that. And so I go upstairs. He gets dressed. We go and have pizza. I've calmed down. We have a nice time out. Saturday, I say nothing. Sunday, I say nothing. Sunday, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he's starting his homework. He says, "I'm so mad at myself. I'm such a jerk. I can't believe I spent the whole day playing Fortnite." Now, this is not the most primo opportunity to say, "I told you so" as a parent, right? But no, I certain measure of self-restraint. And somewhat sympathetic, I said, I'm sorry to hear that. How many hours do you think you spent playing Fortnite? I don't know, 8 or 9? Okay. If you reflected on that, how many hours do you think would have been enough to sort of get your Fortnite fix? And he's like, probably 4, maybe 5. I said, okay. I said, in the future, would it help you if I helped you kind of on a plan so you could manage your use of technology, so you could still enjoy that day off and play with your friends who are in New York, cousin lives up here, and play Fortnite, but not feel like you wasted the whole day? And he said, yeah, I'd really appreciate that. I said, okay, well, when the next one comes around, we'll have a conversation in advance. I have just cemented now for the rest of my life, at least, if not his, my role as technology consultant, right? Because I now have I have his buy-in. And so I certainly would have designed that use of a Friday very differently than 9 hours straight of Fortnite. But we look for our opportunities, right? And again, it's hard. But when we start thinking that the most important thing is that my son or daughter doing what I think is the most important thing right now, I get that. There's a short-term benefit to his learning another song for piano, going for a run, heaven forbid, cleaning his room. There's a real short-term benefit to that. But I have to tell you, when you look at what goes on in high school and in college and the issues of mental health, for me, there's just can be nothing more important than the healthy development of your child's brain. And we want it to be stress tolerant, and we want it to be intrinsically motivated. And really trying to use the force of your will to get him to do this thing right now, tomorrow, there's a cost to that. So I would, for me, I would pick your battles and be judicious about this. And for him to have spent an entire Friday playing Fortnite, it makes a good story for me, right? Does it really long-term have a profound impact on anything that really matters in terms of, I don't know, life, college, whatever? If he cleaned his room instead, it'd still be a mess today. It wouldn't make any difference, right? But in that situation, I told him that I trusted him to use that day how he wanted to use that day. He rued how he spent it. He learned that in ways that I'm sure are much more profound than my lecturing him for hours and hours and hours. And I'm now in a position where he will, or at least says he will, gladly take my help when he's in that situation again.
All right, I think we have time for one last question.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you can bring this back down again to 2, 3, 4-year-olds. Because my children are in their 20s, and they're like your kids, it sounds like, and I parent a lot like you're speaking, but I'm an educator now, and I see parents hearing these kinds of messages and thinking that means the 2-year-old gets to decide when they go to bed, what they eat for breakfast, what they wear, when they get the stroller, whether they walk, or whether they go to the wagon. And I see those parents' stress levels going up, and the children having fits. And it just doesn't seem like that it works the same way from 2 to 18.
Well,
you could kind of bring it down.
Sure. I mean, the thing is that children, if children are given responsibility that they aren't developmentally able to handle, it just makes them anxious and stressed. I mean, children feel safe when they know that we have their backs and that we're taking care of things that they aren't able to take care of. So we don't give little kids, we don't ask them to make decisions about stuff that they aren't capable of making. But with 2-year-old, we do want, I mean, certainly virtually every preschool that's developmentally sensitive has free choice time. What do you want to do? Where it's respectful. Do you want to do it this way or that way? And so with young children, part of it is just communicating that respect through the idea of limited choices. And I think also that, you know, part of the reason there's a lot of reasons that supported this idea in my own thinking of the sense of control. And one was that there's a guy by the name of Ross Greene who got famous writing a book called The Explosive Child about kids who are rigid and emotionally reactive and have a lot of tantrums. And what he said is that once kids start to get stressed, that trying to force them, it just doesn't work, because you can say, look, you get it together, or if you get it together, I'll take you to Disney World, or if you don't get it together, I'm going to nail you to the wall. And it doesn't matter, because once they're stressed, they can't think straight. And so what he recommended is you avoid, you try to minimize situations where you're going to go to the mat with a kid. And so with little kids, we want as much as possible to think about what are the things that can provoke a kid's tantrum and try to avoid. And also, kids don't have to have a consequence for everything that they do. There's some things that we can just let slide. Part of Ross Greene's approach is he talked about a basket A and a basket B and a basket C. And basket A is stuff where it's worth risking a tantrum. If a 3-year-old were crossing a busy street and they don't want to hold your hand, you hold their hand. And even if they're going to cry and pitch a fit, you hold their hand. That's basket A. Basket B is things where it's behaviors where it's important, but it doesn't have to be solved immediately. So that you don't necessarily have to get into a fight about something. Whether a kid uses the right fork, whether a kid puts his toys away every single time. I tell a story in the book about my daughter was 5 and was in a child care program. And she didn't want to clean up at the end. I got a power struggle with her trying to get her to clean up. And eventually, I gave up. It's a little embarrassing. As a child psychologist, somebody came up and said, "Who's winning here, Bill?" And so I said, "Listen, honey, we're going home." We'll clean up. And she's 36. She still doesn't clean up. but in any case, so that's part of it. Is we want kids to feel safe, and they feel safe when they know that we're making decisions, we're taking care of things that they can't. But we want to look for these opportunities to say that you and your brother are different, and I care about the way that you're different from your brother. I care about what you think about things. I care about the way you want to do things. And certainly, I will also say that some of this message is about autonomy, sense that this is my life. But some of a sense of control is also not feeling overwhelmed. I mean, certainly when you feel overwhelmed, you have a very low sense of control. And so with little kids, try to get the sleep part down. And sleep specialists want you, ideally, you wake up on your own. Ideally, we find ways to kids so that they wake up on their own, and they aren't, and we have regular schedules of napping and and nighttime sleep, so that they don't, so they aren't so likely to feel overwhelmed. Do you want to add?
Yeah, no, I would certainly echo that idea that there are choices that kids at age 5 could handle that they can't at age 3. And so giving people, what do you want for dinner tonight could be overwhelming to a 3-year-old, because that's an endless number of choices. Do you want this or do you want that? Do you want to read this story or do you want to read that story? And you can usually see the response of the kid. If I don't know, well, you've given them a choice that they kind of can't handle. Or you can also say, do you want that choice? Or I can make that choice for you. But I think you can really see if kids are fighting you on it, then to Bill's point, that may be a basket C kind of thing where you just kind of let it slide. And the last thing that I'd sort of say is sort of getting back to both the sleep and the non-anxious presence is that little kids, even as much as we love them, they can push our buttons, right? We get tired too, and we get frustrated too. And it's something to pay attention to, that if you feel frustrated with your son or daughter, then you can assume that he or she feels that too. And so, again, Bill had this client who was a humorist, right, who 30 years ago said it's really not raising children, it's lowering parents. And so we want to be mindful of, sort of the Maya Angelou thing, right? Particularly at a young age, our kids are going to get what we do for them, and they're going to forget what we tell them. But what they will remember and what will get wired into their brains is how we made them feel. So when particularly with little guys, what we want them to do is feel loved and supported and capable, and as much as possible, like they have brains and they make decisions. They just happen to be little people, little decision brains, while they're still little people with little decisions.
And I still think this message, again, with my son, I started giving this message that you're the expert on you at age 3. It's just about things he really could know about. You know when you're hungry. Go outside and see if you need a coat. That we can do that with little kids. And obviously, there's some kids who are so stubborn that they walk out in the middle of a snowstorm without a coat. But for most kids, if you say, go outside and see whether you need a coat, you can do that with little kids. There's things like that where you say, I respect your individuality. And I'll just say that part of the reason that I love this approach as I've gotten older is that I become more and more humbled about not knowing what's in a kid's best interest. And this doesn't apply to 2-year-olds, but some years ago I got a call from a mother whose kid had, he was like a senior in high school, and he and 15 or 16 of his friends had gone to a school function bringing drugs and alcohol. And so they got suspended for 3 days. And the kid, my client, when he was home doing his suspension, his father had a heart attack, and the kid knew CPR and resuscitated his dad and called 911 and saved his dad's life. And then the dad had to go into the hospital for a couple days, and so the family had to cancel their vacation on the beach in Indonesia the week the major tsunami hit Indonesia. And so the kid, in some ways, I know a lot about how drugs and alcohol affect the adolescent brain, and it's bad. But these kids wondered. The mother said that they still ask themselves, was it a good thing or a bad thing? We saved his whole family. And I think that so often that with little kids, another way this applies to little kids is that it's very hard. There's nothing that produces more murderous impulses in parents than if people aren't nice to your kids. And this idea of whose problem is it? We would launch it, we get emotionally reactive and can launch into solving little kids' problems. When actually, if we take a step back and be calm and realize that for many kids, a hard situation can be, and dealing with it well, can be very growth promoting.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ned, for an amazing, engaging conversation. And thank you, everybody.
Pour passer à douche écossaise, je suis là.